Hello once again, everybody. One way or another, we seem to keep coming back to this topic, to this issue, which seems to be almost the crisis or the challenge of the day, which is the issue of disconnection or separation. There are so many of us that seem like we want to be able to connect in a much deeper way to life. Now, that could be connecting to our work. It could be connecting at home with our family, connecting to others. It could be just connecting to that idea of purpose and meaning and peace and calm and joy and ease within our lives. But it seems like for some reason, that connection just doesn't happen quite the way that we expect it to. And that's so much of the journey that we continue to take here on One Idea Away. And, we keep going out and finding just extraordinary people with these great backgrounds, wonderful stories and insights to share with you all, because one way or another, it's those stories that we do connect to that help us touch something within ourselves. And that's what really might help things connect for you in the path and the journey that you're meant to travel. And so the other part of this, and I think we're going to get into this as well today, is it's great for us to talk about being in connection, whether that's with ourselves or with others or with meaning or with peace or whatever. What does that actually look like? Like, what does that mean on a day-to-day, everyday type of basis? And what does it look like also beyond ourselves? Meaning, how do we connect more deeply as a society, as communities, as, dare I say, politics? There's just such a bigger conversation to be had there, so that this is not only our personal work, but this is also the work that we do together and how we bring that out into the world. And that's one of the really unique aspects that I think we're going to get into today. I was very fortunate that one of our other guests, Jesse Israel of The Big Quiet, introduced me to the work of Aaron Rose. And you may have run across Aaron on Instagram. You can find him at Aaron X Rose. And just the message that he brings and the way in which he has kind of weaved together this message of connection and of love, but is using it for things like social justice and talking to corporations and organizations, not typically where you see this conversation going. And so I think it's a really unique blend. I think it's a great and wonderful, unique perspective that we want to get into. And so formally, let me introduce our guest today, Aaron Rose, transformational coach for public figures, as well as an inclusive culture consultant, a motivational speaker, energy worker, and a human being. More importantly than anything else, a human being committed to changing and enjoying the world at the same time. He's devoted to healing our crisis of separation and political polarization by designing radically inclusive community cultures, facilitating individual recovery from trauma and isolation, and empowering the next generation of changemakers to lead the way. Aaron has facilitated cultural transformation across multiple industries, from wellness and spirituality to tech and finance, using a unique mix of restorative justice, neuroscience, metaphysics, and meditation. I told you guys, this is not the usual approach. His clients have included McKinsey, Columbia University, Greenpeace, T-Mobile, a whole bunch more. And as a transformational coach and energy worker, Aaron helps public figures transcend their fears of criticism and embrace their unique role in building a better world. Having experienced both violent discrimination and unfounded privilege, Aaron is a champion of a world where we are celebrated for our unique incarnations while also transcending the labels that keep us divided. Aaron, that's just an awesome background, man. An incredible, incredible story. Welcome to One Idea Away, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
One of the places, and I think let's use this as kind of the jumping off point, because I think there's many different aspects of this conversation we can get into. But I do like to begin with just asking, what do you see as being at the heart of your work and your message? That real core of it that you would love for people to really, truly understand about your work and message in the world?
At the core, and this answer comes through a little bit differently every time, but today at the core, it is this rejection of the idea that to be human is to be broken and disconnected, and this reclamation of the idea that it is our true human nature to be powerful, to be connected, to have an experience of abundance and ease, and to live in harmony with everything around us. And so truly, I am kind of a radical optimist who's here to bring a sense of hope and the practices to back it up, that says we can live in a healed and whole world, and we can have that experience within our own lives. And it's really about applying that medicine of love to every area where we find ourselves in separation, which is most places in most of our lives these days.
Sure. it is obviously with a message like that of, being able to connect to that wholeness and to love, that must mean you've had such an easy life to get to this point, right?
Oh yeah, it's just been smooth sailing. No, it's been, that expression of the law of polarity,
Yeah.
where I see my life. It's almost like this big pendulum where it just got pulled into maximum darkness at the beginning, and it was like darker and darker and darker.
Yeah.
And now we're on that swing into the equal and opposite light,
Mhm.
which gives me a lot of hope for myself and for the world, knowing that there's always ultimately an equal amount of dark and light, maybe even a little bit more light than dark.
Sure.
But yeah, I had a pretty intense experience in my first few decades of life, growing up in a really conservative Catholic context as someone who somewhat identifies being LGBTQ, growing up really feeling like I didn't have a voice, and then going out into the world and experiencing discrimination and harassment because of my gender and my sexuality, and really feeling like, just like that image of like a dog in a corner, like sort of just, or even a cat in a corner, kind of ready to lash out. And I was doing social change work from a very early age because I was just like, guys, we got to do something about this, and
Yeah.
I was always very passionate about it. And even though I was in a very optimistic place in my work, always, there was a real sense of defensiveness and deep fear, and just this sense of like the world is out to get me, and that kind of like victim narrative as well, until really like my early to mid 20s, things began to shift and I began to have new tools for navigating it. But
Mm.
it was, when I think back on the first 2 decades of my life, while there are beautiful moments for
Yeah.
sure, the overall tenor of it is just this weight, this heaviness, this sense of like darkness and murkiness and
Yeah.
confusion.
Let me ask you, I do want to talk about, some of what facilitated just kind of that shift and lightness that now does come through you. And so very clearly, it's something that just has stuck out to me with the work that you're doing, the messages you share. Before that time, how did you find your way through that darkness? Because there's a lot of people who go through that trauma, that isolation that that you mentioned in your background, and it's a dark time, and it's very, very difficult for us to see that there is light. It's difficult for us to see and connect to any form of hope, and yet you did navigate through those times. And I'm just kind of curious, what do you feel was present, or what was it that kept you through those times, so that the shift then could take hold and take you to a completely different place?
Yeah, two things are coming through right now. One is just a sense of wonder, right? No matter how dark things were, I was always, even if it took, the metaphorical bird kind of knocking on my window three
Yeah.
or four times for me to come out of my haze and notice it and appreciate it. I was always someone who loved nature. I love the ocean. I love a good tree,
Yeah.
and I love a good joke. Like even if I was kind of retracted in certain ways, there was always a piece of me that was like, I love swimming. I love putting my feet on the earth.
Yeah.
I love, even reading books. Also, like Harry Potter was a big part of my journey as well. I'm definitely part of that generation. Like finding ways to appreciate the magic of the world
Yeah.
definitely was a huge piece of that. Even if things
Mm.
felt like it was falling apart, even being able to like enjoy an apple that I was eating and be like, apples are great. Like
Yeah.
somehow apples exist. There was a piece of me that was
Yeah.
always kind of looking for that silver lining, looking for those everyday joys.
Yeah.
And then the second piece is very paradoxical, but when it lands with us, it really opens up so much freedom, which is that it's almost like if we look at our outrage at the circumstances of our life, and we look at, it does not make sense that I feel so constricted,
Mm.
or I'm so upset that I feel so upset, or I'm so anxious that I feel so anxious, or I'm so outraged that I'm being treated in this way. It's like, if we can look at that and understand the truth underneath it, it's showing us that we're not operating in our natural state.
Mm.
And if we can take a little bit of, paradoxically, remove the self-blame but take 100% responsibility for our
Yeah.
experience at the same time, for me there was always this deep sense of like, this isn't right. Even though it's messed up, something about this is inorganic. And I think that that really drove me, because I was, even I remember being 3, 4 years old, sitting in a Catholic church, singing my own songs, singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and just sort of trying, subconsciously at that age, kind of trying to shift the vibration of the space, trying to shift or just feeling like I don't want to participate in this, not even intellectually understanding what was happening. And so I think that sense of like the not wrongness, or sorry, the not rightness or the wrongness of my circumstances was very depressing to me at times, but it also kept me moving forward, because I knew that it wasn't my ultimate state. And there was something that just kept me searching for that key that would unlock what was more natural about being human.
There's two things there. One, just in terms of the navigating through dark times, the ability to be able to connect to those everyday joys. I think it's so often that we discount the importance of just those little tiny moments. It doesn't have to be big and grandiose and spectacular for us to, wake up or something like that. It can be these really just simple moments, and what might even be just a couple of seconds out of your day may very well be the fuel that just keeps you open and keeps you just that little tiny bit hopeful when things are really truly a struggle. The second thing, though, and this is where I really wanted to dive in, is I think to me, one of the things that I have seen in your message and the way that you bring yourself into this world and present yourself in this world stems from that idea of, you described it as when we feel that not rightness in our lives, that we know that this just doesn't make sense. Why do I feel this way? Why is it such a struggle? Why do I doubt these things or whatever? Usually, when people become activists or otherwise, that usually gets expressed with outrage, and specifically the emphasis with rage. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of that almost animosity coming through in our society right now, because it's probably been held back for just countless generations at this point. And I guess that's the part that I'm most intrigued by, is how did that struggle of not rightness actually become a source of extraordinary light for you, as opposed to just being another fire of outrage in this society at this point?
It's a beautiful question. Well, I'm a very determined person. And so I was very determined to experience joy, to experience freedom. And after several years of yelling at a lot of people, I got my start as, it was always, it's never completely black and white. When I was 14, 15 years old, I was going around my high school giving presentations about how to think globally and act locally, talking about very optimistic, like, okay, guys, so like malaria, really big situation, but what can you do about it? And so I had that angle, but then, there was a lot of, raging against my parents, raging against the system. Like I was the activist who was like chaining myself to things and marching in the streets and ending up in fights with people on Facebook. Like you need to clean up your language. And, that vitriol expressed itself through me in moments of exasperation and of really being offered that as a tool. Like, it's actually very paradoxical to think like, oh, I can achieve what I want through love. Wait a minute. I don't have to fight and defend myself all of the time. And so, for me, it was this process of being an activist and looking around and saying, Gandhi says that our means have to reflect the ends that we seek to create. And so the way we're doing the work has to look like the future we're creating. And when I look around, I don't feel so good. People around me don't feel so good. And so it kept me curious. It kept me searching for better solutions. And ultimately it was, the transformative medicine of love. True love, not this sort of like conciliatory, transactional, zero-sum love that is so dominant in our society today. But it really was this, the determination not to be right and not to win one over on people, but to actually feel free in my body in a moment by moment way, and to be a true revolutionary in the sense of like really actually upending the deepest root of why we're in these situations. That's what's brought me to the methodology that I use today. And I will say that I agree that, you know, there's also a place for anger. Anger is that step where we're like, wait a minute, my boundaries have been crossed and that's not okay. And so I do think that, you know, I look with the eyes of love upon the anger that I see, particularly online these days, because we finally have a social context where people can say, I'm really upset. This thing happened to me. And not only did it happen to me, but I'm carrying the unexpressed pain of generations of people within my body that's also coming out. So I'm never one to say to someone, you know, you need to quiet down, but I know that for me, there was a lot of liberation in coming out on the other side of that chapter.
I bet. And it's again, a lot of things in here. I'm going to bring it back to something that you mentioned before of when we decide that we are going to move forward, it is not necessarily the self-blame of, you know, how things have come to be, blaming myself or blaming others. It's that responsibility. And that responsibility is simply from this point forward. And if we tie that to this idea of the means need to reflect the end, it gives us a compass. It gives us a true north that we can continue to orient ourselves towards, even though we're human beings. We're going to have a whole range of emotions, and you should have the whole range of emotions. And how do you take responsibility for working through those in a manner that lead back to that true north and to that compass, to the ends that we seek? And so I guess that something that different things, two further things that you brought up. I think we, as much as we want to be able to speak and voice the pain that we feel, one of the things you recognized is that rage begets rage, anger begets anger. And so if we're only feeding back into the system, into the conversation, that which we're actually trying to take out of it in the first place, it's not going to go anywhere. And so, you know, that can just be a recognition point for those of us that are frustrated or do want to speak out. Just remember that dynamic and the energy that you're bringing in may make it more combustible as opposed to working through it in a different capacity. And I think that's where you get into this idea of looking beneath and what are those deeper roots. And I guess, Aaron, that's part of what have you found as you've done that peeling back, that uncovering process. What have you found to be some of the deeper roots that are really at the core of what's going on? Because when we heal at that level, we have a much greater ripple effect, systemic type change in ourselves as well as in our relationships and beyond.
Absolutely. And that has been one of the core truths that's guided my work in the last few years, is really this sense of what is happening externally is a mirror reflection of what's happening internally. And so it was not about this abdication of social justice work, but it was starting to understand, okay, if there's fear out in the world, then that must mean that there's fear in me. If there's hate coming at me, that must mean that I still kind of hate myself. And so looking at those roots and seeing that, and everybody has many different perspectives on like, where did the fear come from, right? And I am a very multidimensional, multi-perspective person at this point. And so I'm less interested in charting to the exact initiation moment, but knowing that there are collective thought forms, shall we say, on our earth right now that make us feel fear, that make us feel like love is scarce, that make us feel like money is scarce, that make us feel like someone else's well-being is a zero-sum game with ours. And so if they have it, then we don't have it. And this illusion of scarcity, this illusion that, you know, once an idea gets going, it just picks up like a snowball, as we know, and we're parroting it to each other and we're receiving it through the media. Yeah. And we're telling a story of what's possible that's then creating the reality that we see around us, reflected from our internal state around us. And so then once you start to see that scarcity, once we have stepped out of that metaphorical Garden of Eden where we have everything that we need, and then we're in this scarce landscape, it just reinforces itself because then we see the evidence. For me, in my own life, it was, you know, getting that very early programming of the world, it's not safe for me to be myself. And so what did I experience even after I left the complications of my childhood home was people all around me who weren't like me, hurting me, attacking me, criticizing me. And as we're talking through this, I'm sure people can feel the sort of multidimensional aspects of this. It's like what's happening within yourself about your own self-concept, but also these shared ideas that we have. And I'll just give an example. You know, I have a client right now who they're looking at racial diversity in their organization. Or in their sort of brand. It's two people with a pretty big public brand. And they've been saying, I feel like there's only white people in our space. I feel like people critique us for being really exclusive, but we keep inviting people and they keep not coming. And we did a little simple hypnosis guided meditation, however you want to think about it, just dropping into the subconscious. And we looked at, okay, in order to experience a world in which it's hard for you to share space with people of color, what would you have to believe? What's the root of this experience? And we came out of it, and one of them was like, oh my God, I just remembered all these times as a child when my parents would tell me not to play with kids who weren't white. And I learned that I wasn't supposed to have them as friends, right? And that can feel so simple, but it's like, whew, I have the full body chills talking about it, because it's going back to that root and saying, okay, where did that even come from? That comes from generation after generation after generation of that programming. And so, yeah, we could like talk about how to make your flyer more inclusive, or we could look at the thing within you that's holding people at a distance, that's keeping you in fear rather than in love. So that's the core medicine of my work. And it can feel very overwhelming for people to realize that they're fully in the driver's seat, but it's also the most empowering thing once you just decide that it's all your creation.
Yeah. You know, it can be challenging. It can be extremely hard work, certainly to look at ourselves in that fashion. And it's certainly, I think, a repeated message that comes up is this idea of, if we want to bring about that change, we need to begin by looking in the mirror. And that mirror's got to go pretty deep in terms of what we see. There's just so much there. And I think we pick up more in that self-image and the way that we see and perceive and believe about the world. There are so many conditions that we've been through. There are so many experiences and moments and things that were said to us when we were younger that we don't even remember today, but they are still within us. Combine that with all of the ways in which we are interconnected in our communities and schools and society and as countries and everything else. You've got all of these different forces that are coming at us and reconditioning whatever it is that's already there and more deeply ingraining it. And the reason why I bring all this up is that for any of us to be able to look at this within ourselves does two things. One is, it certainly can be very liberating for us as individuals, because we can now more fully show up as exactly who we really intended to be and really truly are. And if it's true for you, this has to be true for others as well.
Yeah.
And does that open up that compassion and that love and that deeper connection to be able to say, hey, we may not be getting along right now at this surface level, but there's something I can see in you that I recognize because I've also done that work in me.
Totally.
And I'm curious is, how do we, I guess I'm curious about your process. I'm curious about the way that you peel back, whether that be with individual clients or otherwise, or even just your own journey of the work that you've done, of how did you continue to go through that process of peeling back so that you could unseed some of the things that were not meant to be there?
Well, the first piece, I think, is just presence and committing to a daily practice. And with everything, there's a paradox. I'm not interested in a story that like it's going to take us 5,000 lifetimes to get rid of racism and climate change. Like, I have a vision of myself in 50 years, in 60 years, whenever it is, that, we're in a fully new paradigm on this earth. So I'm not interested in feeding a story that, we're just going to barely chip away. And then the next, I'm in it for radical, comprehensive change within my lifetime. That's the vision that I have to hold for myself. And at the same time, it is about understanding that that happens through a moment by moment practice. And so I do work with clients around like, what is your presence practice? For some people, that is meditation. For some people, we start with really basic, just like breath work techniques where we're just tuning into the body and we're creating that as a regular container to begin to hold space. Because and a lot of people, I'm just thinking of this wonderful young man who was in one of my sessions a couple of months ago, who very bravely raised his hand in the middle of a corporate workshop that was geared. It was branded as being about like empathy and healthy
Right.
communication. And he raised his hand. And he was like, I'm afraid to take a deep breath because I don't know what's going to come up. There's a lot down there. And when we create this daily practice, it becomes less this like, okay, I'm going to the doctor every 6 months, or I'm going on like an 8-day shamanic journey to clear everything from my system, or like my detox. And it becomes okay to feel big emotions on a day-to-day basis. And we start to, and it's like safety. When I talking with parents about how to build a better relationship with their kids, it's like, there needs to be a container that they always know is there. It's like, okay, every day at 7 p.m., I ask you how your day was, or we do a little share, or every Sunday we have a little family meeting. And same for, bosses and employees. It's like, we need that container to know that it's, so that we don't have to come in with like the battering ram to rock bottom us into creating that moment of presence. And so I think that's just coming through very strongly today as it's a big technique for people. And for me, that is what has been the most revolutionary, because it also takes your mind out of it. It takes your mind out of being like, do I need to, spend 20 minutes purging my ancestral racial trauma today? It's like, I have a 20-minute meditation practice. I'm setting an intention to live in a healed and whole world. I know that there are these areas that I'm working on. Let's see what comes up. And obviously we can dedicate certain time to certain issues, but having that regular container creates trust with yourself, and it becomes a safer experience. So that's really, really important. And the second piece is like knowing what your fundamental decision about what kind of world you're living in is. Like, do you live in a benevolent universe or not? Do you deserve abundance? Do you deserve safety? Is it human nature to be in harmony or not? And having those core beliefs where you're just like, even when there's a storm of emotion and external chaos, like, what are you rooted in? And almost in the same way that you would with like someone that you're like, I'm in love with you, and they're like, not right now. Cancel, clear, delete any patriarchal programming from this metaphor, but this sense of like, I'm going to be here for you, and I'm just going to hold this love in my heart for you no matter what's going on. Being that devoted to how we want the world to be, so that there's less and less of this looking at the external world and being like, wait, is it our natural nature to be harmonious? Wait, do I deserve to have my needs met? And we're just anchoring those sort of core foundational beliefs as much as possible. There's many layers to this, but that's what's come through today.
I mean, those are a couple of very big ones to begin with. On the one side, coming back to that idea of a presence practice, to me, it's the beauty of the simplicity as well as the difficulty of exactly that. Simple to understand, difficult to master per se, I guess, or takes the practice, but it is something that's daily that we can tune into. And I love the conversation or the perspective of having that container, because I think what you also described is not only the safety that container creates, but it's that moment in time where we feel like we can fully feel what is there and is present, and we can be fully seen, even if that's just us seeing ourselves. It doesn't have to necessarily be with another, although certainly I think it amplifies when we are able to move into that space with others and be in community or family in some respect. But it's a very, very powerful space. And it's something that as human beings is part of our journey. We're social creatures. We're meant to feel, we're meant to connect, and creating that container where we feel safe to do that. Obviously that's the beginning of then expanding that. And how can I do that elsewhere within my life? That then further idea of being devoted to showing up in the way that I wish the world to be. That container and that presence practice is your gym time for being able to then do that at the moments that you are most challenged. And
Exactly.
right. And so something you mentioned, I guess, with one of the individual who's in the audience of, I'm afraid to even take the deep breath because I'm worried about what will come up. What that made me think of, and then as you described, how is it that you see the world? Two things or what's going on right now in the world, and two different ways of looking at it. We could look at the world right now and we could say there is so much challenge. There's so much division. There are so many problems. We are so divided like we've never been before. Things are awful. Things are terrible. This is catastrophe. It's the chaos of things. Or we could look at it as, oh, maybe we finally gotten present enough to know that this was always here in the first place, that this is surfacing so that we actually can reconcile it. Chaos is actually the sign of a system coming into higher order. This has to occur. This is part of the natural process. We can see it. We've got the advantage. We can see it from either way, and we can see it from any number of different vantage points in between there. But that's what you're reflecting back is that, okay, let's step back and really ask yourself, how is it you're seeing the world? Because based on the way that you see it and the way that you believe things about it, that's going to be your experience.
Completely. And I love that chaos is a sign of a system coming into higher order. That's absolutely how I see it. When I look at the world now, I see, wow, humanity is so desperate to return to our state of love that we are just like, we're in a full-on detox. We cannot avoid all that we've been ignoring that's been keeping us in separation from our true nature. And it's coming up like anthropomorphized zombies in some situations. And it's our opportunity to look at it and to say, we can see it, to free it. This isn't about living in a permanent state. And the visual that was coming to mind as you were speaking is, you know, we've all seen a really messy room that we've had to clean up. And we don't look at the messy room and say, well, I guess the permanent state of this room is messy. Like, we can see through the mess to what the room needs to look like and what its natural state is. And that's the process that we're in.
I think that's a wonderful thing. And because I think that guidepost of when we really know what we believe and that ends that we want to be able to achieve through the means that we conduct ourselves, being able to know that their clean room is there is that belief, right? That's the guiding principle that's back there for us. And the thing then that came to mind is that when you've got that incredibly messy room, not that I'm a parent of a teenager, but theoretically I know what you're describing, is the fact that when we then go to clean it up, it never really takes quite as long as we think. It's actually a quicker process when we get the momentum and the commitment and, you know, kind of dedicate ourselves to that type of direction. A lot of these things do begin to unfold and pick up an extraordinary momentum that we can't even fathom at this moment. From that regard, I guess the piece, because in the next few minutes, I did want to get to is, how does this then translate? I mean, you're going in and speaking to corporations. You're still doing social justice type work. I've even heard you, refer to it, I think, as the metaphysics of social justice, which may be one of the greatest phrases I think I've heard in terms of social justice. How does it translate? We're doing all of this deep work, and we're talking about how it is that things are surfacing for us to be able to work through so that we can show up and be more connected to ourselves and to others in our lives. But what does that mean when we've got such a complex, interconnected world with systemic level issues that we're trying to face, and we're trying to face them from a completely new paradigm? What does that actually look like? How do we do that?
It starts with that commitment, with intention. And sometimes even before intention, it starts with vision. That's where I start with all of my clients, be it a one-on-one client or a corporate client where I'm in a room of 200 people. We get clear on, what do we actually want to experience? We picture ourselves walking through the door of the office. How does it feel? Who's there? What's the newspaper headline about what y'all are doing together? How do you talk about the work that you're doing when you're hanging out with your friends? Getting clear on that vision, because so often we can set really fear-based intentions, like the intention of I just don't want to feel as awful. It's like, okay, that's an okay intention. Mm-hmm. But what if the intention was, really staking our claim to an experience of connection and peace? And so, and that I find helps create unity even as we're working through some really hard stuff, especially in a corporate setting where there's lots of different dynamics and lots of sort of social norms and things like that. If there's a moment of tension, it's like we're all really clear on why we're there. We're holding a vision that's not just my imposition of what I think they should experience. It's co-created. And then we set the intention to experience that. and we set the intention to take radical 100% responsibility for our experience. And then when it comes to these identity-based issues, we go from these sort of broader kind of metaphysical, A Course in Miracles, zoomed out, love is the only thing that's real, what's outside is inside. And we go in and we say, what are my identities right now? My current earthly incarnation, how am I showing up? What does that mean about the legacy of violence and privilege and oppression and being an oppressor that I carry within my body? And how can I take 100% responsibility for that? And for everybody, it means a combination of showing up, cleaning up, and letting yourself feel how you feel. A straight white man carries a huge amount of grief and rage at the legacy of being, when you dehumanize someone, it is an act of violence to yourself. And there's this rage of even having been duped into a system where it made sense to have power over people rather than power with people. So, even someone that someone might say is very, very privileged has a huge amount of returning to self and honoring of grief and shame and anger, just as much as someone who has been more in that kind of oppressed group. And so there is that self-work of loving oneself and saying, I truly honor everything you've experienced. And then saying, where's the cleanup? For me, I'll use myself as two examples here. One, LGBTQ person. I have work to do to clear the limiting beliefs about what it means to be LGBTQ, and to fully honor and love myself for my embodiment, for who I love, and to clear any of that shame. And then to begin to open my heart and clear any stories that say, a straight person won't get me. We can't be friends. Like that's not true. Yeah. And so I have the opportunity to lean into opening my heart. And then as a white man, I have the opportunity to look at, okay, what kind of cleanup needs to happen in my past? Where did I, laugh at a sexist joke? Where did I maybe even do something significantly worse than laugh at a sexist joke? And doing that amends making, doing that as a white person, doing reparations, paying back Black people in the US for the stolen labor that they experienced, going back and very specifically attending to these things and looking at, listening to the experience of people who are different than you and hearing what they're saying. I hear from women all the time, please just listen to me. Yeah. Like, please just actually validate my emotions. And so it's like, okay, in every moment, I can go back and I can make apologies. I can feel forgiveness and remorse in my heart. I can physically make changes. And then I can also look at, maybe there's a woman in my comments on Instagram saying, I don't feel like you're hearing me. And I could bring my little logical male assessment and say, well, actually in this situation, I'm completely justified. And, 75% of your pain makes sense and I'm willing to meet you there. And then we'll talk about it. Or I could just say, whoa, this is an old pattern on autopilot. She's upset. I say she's too upset. Then she feels bad and I feel bad and we're separate. Or I could just lean into it and say, I see you. Thank you for sharing how you're feeling with me. Yeah. And hold that frequency. And in that moment, it's like, boom, domino effect in both directions, forward and back through the generations, changing the dynamic. And so the work that I do is about bringing people into presence enough to address the fear-based patterns that exist within all of our identities. And then ultimately, like you said, we do the work and then we move out of it. I am far less attached to my own sexuality and my own gender as it relates to anybody else than I have been in my entire life, because I've cleaned up so much of that separateness that I can honor it as being true about myself, but it's not a point of contention in my life anymore, when it was one of the most dramatic points of contention in my life for a long time.
There's so much that's in what you just shared and said. One thing I'm going to maybe pull out as a thread in this and use it as a starting point. Love the perspective of people becoming present to and recognizing the tension that may exist within an experience or a moment in time, because that tension is such a cue for us that there is something that's going on that isn't actually connected. Otherwise it'd be a lot more fluid. And so it's a wonderful point of presence. And then to describe it as being present to that, being okay to that, being open to see what it is that is actually there. With that openness is a degree of courage that we also have to stay within that particular moment, and that ongoing evolution of our own awareness to be able to recognize not just what this moment is in context or detail, but to recognize the patterns that might be there, the identities that might be there, all of the stuff that's going on underneath and in between, so to speak. That all of a sudden, to me, the stuff you're talking about is it's the being able to see the ones and zeros of the matrix. To me,
Exactly. The
right.
matrix was coming through because that's a metaphor I use sometimes. It's
Sure.
like, whoa, all of a sudden you just have that moment of presence and you're like, is it more important to me to be right, or would I actually feel better if I did something different in this moment? And if I saw it as courageous not to push someone away and defend myself, but to soften into the moment from a high self-worth place, not from like, I'm the worst, okay, but like, I'm gonna show up heart open, not playing out the old story.
It's that openness, it's that compassion, it's that softening into that you're describing, that I believe people are beginning to understand is actually the greatest strength we can ever demonstrate. And that may very well be one of the extraordinary gifts of being human, is that's actually the stuff that kind of makes us up and is the greatest gift and strength that we actually possess. We've just been conditioned away from it for a while. And so now's the time that, we have all of these wonderful opportunities going on in the world today that give us the chance to begin to do things differently. Aaron, I guess maybe just before we wrap up, a lot of the people that listen to this show, they are from all walks of life, all different stages of the journey, as it were. But certainly I think they connect into this show because there is that piece of connection that maybe they're still looking for or struggling with, that piece of separation that, whether they recognize it or not, is something that they still feel. And for those that are kind of on the journey, but they're still feeling that, I'm just curious if you have any, kind of final thoughts or words or anything that you would love to share with them at this time for it to sink in maybe just that little bit further for them.
Yeah, I would say get curious about any resistance that has come up while listening to this.
Mm-hmm.
Any like, oh, that's highly optimistic. Oh, that's nice for you to say. Any of that. And believe me, I feel it all the time too. I have to get curious about it as well. But getting curious about why it is that you're in resistance. For some of us, I mean, we've been deeply conditioned into shame related to being hopeful.
Yeah.
Like, we feel a weird curdle of anxiety when we're like, yeah, things could be okay. It's like, how dare you think that? Have you no shame? Have you not seen what's happening out there? And so even understanding that there's that meta level programming to not be hopeful. And then that willingness is everything, like, how are things going for me right now? Would I be willing to have a different experience? Would I be willing to let in a new perspective that might shift things for me? And even just being willing to be willing, just opening the door a little bit. I'm willing to be willing to have a little bit more hope, to see things in a different way. And knowing that your intention is powerful. You're a free will creator of your own experience. And so anything you speak out and anything you commit to will begin to happen. And so if you want to have a new experience, keep claiming it. It's yours, and things are going to shift radically much more quickly than you think they will. And you're also not alone. I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm always in the next level of surrender and clearing and anchoring into what I speak so much about creating. So yeah, it's not a solid, it's up to you and you alone in one sense, but also we all walk together.
Yeah. Aaron, I want to thank you for not just coming on the show, but the work, the lightness that you are bringing into the world, for all the people that you're touching, through the work you do directly, through this audience and through this show. It is that light, that hope, that radical optimism is something that is very much appreciated. And it very much shows. I mean, you just kind of beam out there with your message and your stories and everything you have to share. So I thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much. This has been such a beautiful conversation. Thank you for all of your beautiful questions.
Thank you. For everybody, I think, there's a lot to go back and listen to in this show. I think there's a lot that you can take away. I think I want to end simply with just that note about curiosity. Curiosity just opens us up to whole new ways of seeing the world, whole new patterns that we weren't present to in the past that we can now break just simply because we got curious and we could actually see it. Curiosity leads to different understanding. It leads to a connection point with others. It leads to listening. We do more than enough talking, whether that's online or in our lives, and that chance for us to really, truly, deeply listen, not even just to others, but even to ourselves to understand what's really going on. And to me, curiosity is just one of the wonderful gateways for that. But go back and listen to this conversation, the evolution of how things can come about, the image that you can hold, the vision you can hold for the world, the presence and the openness that allows you to carry the means forward that ultimately actually are part of the ends that we wish to arrive at. As always, I want to thank you for joining us on One Idea Away. And until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Check out IPEC's coach training program at ipeccoaching.com/OIA. And of course, to find out about all the conversations, events, gatherings, all the things that we've got upcoming, then head on over to oneideaaway.com/community. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do us the favor of subscribing, reviewing the show, as well as sharing insights or comments that stood out for you in this episode.